So when I started to look into, I guess, the discrepancies between healthcare for men and for women, and the ways in which I was reduced to a baby-making machine. Basically, if I didn't have an STD and I wasn't infertile, then they weren't going to do anything to help me. Hi, my name is Ellen, and this is why I deconstructed. I grew up in Southern California, in a suburb of Los Angeles, and it was a very typical American middle class upbringing. It was in the 90s, so height of purity culture. I went to what they call Baptist in name only, and it had left the General Convention before we arrived, but it had started as a very small Baptist congregation and had developed into a larger church that was non-denominational. We started going when I was an infant, and over the course of my childhood, we went from a smallish congregation to a mega church, and we ended up building a brand new campus to hold all of the people. One of the things I loved about my church was the sense of community. My mom volunteered a lot at church, and so I kind of grew up running around campus like a pastor's kid, playing with the pastor's kids, when people weren't there. And then we attended events several times a week. It was my domain, running around and playing on campus when no one is there. It feels very much like it belongs to you when you grow up that way in church. When we talked about faith in my house growing up, I would ask questions and get lots of answers from my parents. But I remember a few times we drove to church and we passed several churches along the way. And I remember one day I passed the local Methodist church and I saw the cross on the side of the building. And I asked my mom, why are we passing a church that's clearly a Christian church? Why are we passing a church to go to church? And she said, well, just because there's a cross on the building doesn't mean it's Christian. They have women pastors. And if they're willing to ignore the Bible's very clear teaching about women's pastors, then what else are they ignoring about the Bible? My parents were very involved, very hands-on. They wanted us to grow up in a Christian environment. And so we did a lot of, some of the focus on the family, kind of family Bible studies. It was definitely a Christian home. I went to Awana growing up and memorized all the verses, and my parents, they really wanted to find a church that had Awana. They felt like that was a sign that it was a really Bible teaching church when they had an Awana program. Growing up, I was very committed and I was very on the same page with my church. I felt like, especially being in Awana and being on campus all the time, you get this sense of like, I am serious about my faith. The first time I remember ever feeling any kind of pushback in myself against things that I heard at church was when I got into junior high and high school, and we started to have the modesty talks. And it felt like very unbalanced. It felt like, why aren't they giving the boys the modesty talks? Why, what would that even look like for boys? Why do we have all of these rules about how much skin is showing and whether bra straps are showing and what kind of swimsuit we're allowed to wear to camp and how baggy our t-shirts can be and how long our skirt is? And it felt strange to put all of that onus on the girls instead of, and I know that they had talks with the boys about lust and purity and, but it just felt very unbalanced. It felt strange. And my friends and I would talk to each other about some of the sillier rules, like don't come to church with wet hair, because if you come to church with wet hair, then the boys will think about you being in the shower and they'll think about you naked and they'll stumble. And so those kinds of things were a way that I started pushing back a little bit earlier. My deconstruction began very slowly. It started around the time I got married, and my husband and I had both grown up in the church, and we had received all the same, purity messaging. His was very different from mine, as we came to find out through the different gender lenses, but we got married, and we had waited to have sex until we were married. And we had all of the very prosperity gospel, purity culture messaging of, as long as you wait until you're married, it's going to be phenomenal, it's going to be mind-blowing. And from the very beginning, I had extreme sexual pain. And we didn't really know how to handle that. I had been told it would be painful for a few months and then would get better. And so we just kind of tried to keep pushing through, hoping it would get better. And it kept getting worse. And we weren't really sure what to do about it. I finally went to the doctor, and the doctor had terrible advice for me, just was very confused. It seemed like they'd never heard of anyone having sexual pain before. And they told me to have a glass of wine and take a warm bath, and that, things would get better. And they didn't. And so as I started going on the medical journey of trying to figure out what the problem was, I started to become more aware of how awful the medical system is for women. And I started to kind of absorb some of the feminist critiques of the medical system for women. Growing up, my only exposure to the word feminist or feminism was very negative. Feminism was, something that only non-believers engaged in. So when I started to look into, the discrepancies between healthcare for men and for women, and the ways in which I was reduced to a baby-making machine. Basically, if I didn't have an STD and I wasn't infertile, then they weren't going to do anything to help me. And so my medical journey turned into me having to find all this information on my own and realizing that the system was not helping me. But that started to pull at some of the threads of what is feminism? Why have I been taught that it's this big, bad, awful thing my whole life, when it seems like it could help to address some of these inequalities in medicine? But ultimately, it didn't encourage me very early on to start questioning some of the things that I'd been taught about gender roles. It took several years to even, in fact, more than several, probably about a decade, to start actually pulling at those strings. So I kept on trying to find my own information. I kept on trying to read books, but I was always very careful to pick Christian books about sex because I didn't want, worldly influence, particularly in that subject matter. And so I had read a few, more medical-leaning secular books on sex, but I kept on trying to find Christian literature on sex to see if something would help me. And I remember one day I was reading a book that I had checked out on my Kindle, and it was a Christian sex book, and their advice was just like, think back on those times when everything was so wonderful during your honeymoon phase. And if it hadn't been on my Kindle, I would have just thrown it across the room. I just immediately started crying, and I was so angry because it felt like that was kind of the Christian side of things. That was like one of the better messaging out there. It was all very much like, well, your husband needs it, so even if you don't like it that much, you got to keep doing it. And that had been very damaging advice, especially when I was experiencing sexual pain, because the more that you push through it, the more it sends your body the message that this is not something safe or good or something that I want to do. And so I remember trying to find some other book that would be helpful, and I came across the work of Sheila Ray Gregor, and I read her book, The Great Sex Rescue, and I was like, this is great. This is exactly, like, there are so many things in here that I have come to realize that I'd been taught that were wrong. But the one thing that was in it that I just couldn't get on board with was her connection between, female submission and sexual pain. And I was like, well, that might be true, but I just don't understand how you get around what the Bible says about the wife submitting to the husband. And what's funny is that at that point, my husband had already, for his own reasons, completely deconstructed those views about gender and sexuality in marriage. And he, we were sitting at the dinner table with my children one day, and we were talking about, well, who's in charge? Well, mommy's in charge of you guys and daddy's in charge of mommy. And he's like, no, I'm not. We'd had all the same teaching, all the same messaging, and where is this coming from? And he didn't have a, well, I read this book. He doesn't need all the facts and information like I do. He just felt that something was very wrong with that perspective, that it wasn't in keeping with our equality before God, of us all being made in God's image. And he wasn't having it. And so we decided to kind of let that be. And but I started to look into it for myself, because I was very concerned about why this teaching could be so damaging if it's what the Bible teaches. And so I started reading a variety of sources on female submission and what all of those passages are talking about. And I found Marg Mausko and read her articles. And it was, for me, a very illuminating moment, because it was someone who was treating the Bible as an authority, taking it seriously, but disagreeing with the very fundamentalist interpretation I'd had growing up. And it allowed me to change my position on complementarianism and to formulate a more Bible-based egalitarian perspective. And that was extremely helpful. But it also invited that question of, like, if I would not be able to get to this interpretation on my own. So what is the Bible even for? Like, how can I possibly understand it properly on my own without all of this background, scholarly knowledge, any of it? How am I supposed to have access to God's word if it can be so easily misunderstood? When I started to deconstruct and I started to change my positions on those things early on, there were a few people I could talk to very openly about it who were on similar paths. At the church that we're attending right now, the response was very much, this is not an issue, like, it's not what we're going to be teaching, but we don't have a problem with the variety of perspectives here, and it's not a gospel issue. With some other people, it turned into maybe more of a debate. And what I was raised with was, defend your position. And I hadn't kind of broken away from that kind of perspective of, well, this is the right thing because ABC. So I engaged in some debates early on, and it was a little bit discouraging to me that, the evidence was very clear and obvious at that point, and I was still very much in that certainty mindset. And it was discouraging to feel like I would present the evidence that I found very compelling to other people, and they didn't find it compelling. And so I stopped having those conversations as much because it was discouraging to constantly be debating people, particularly people that I loved. And it was frustrating to, not have them kind of come to the same understanding. And it started to feel like we were just trying to convince each other in our positions. And I just decided to stop having those conversations. After I deconstructed my ideas around gender, it started me on a path of, what other things am I getting wrong? And what else am I going to change my mind on? And what do I still believe? And so as I started to dig further and stopped limiting myself to this very narrow band of resources of people who already agreed with me, and started reading other people and other perspectives and learning more about the broader house of Christianity, I started to change my mind on a lot more positions. And I started to feel like, what's left? And it happened so slowly for such a long time, so many years. My deconstruction was just little tiny piece by little tiny piece. And then it felt like I removed one last piece and the whole house came down. And it felt like losing my entire identity. And I knew that I wanted to try to rebuild. I wanted to see if there was anything left in the rubble to save. And so I started to listen to some more progressive voices. And last year I went to Theology beer camp, and it was so encouraging to hear just wildly different theology and perspectives than anything that I grew up with. My advice to someone who is just starting to question their faith is that if God is a God of truth, then you don't need to be afraid of information. You can read things and they can be very different from what you were taught to believe. And if there is truth there, then it's from God. And if there is not truth there, then you have a better idea of where you stand. I read many things that I didn't agree with at the time, but do now. I read many things that I agreed with and don't agree with anymore. But seeking out information and widening the pool from which you're gaining knowledge isn't this big, bad, scary thing. You don't need to be afraid of information if you really do value the truth.